נברך את מעיין חיינו, שכינת העולם שהחיינו וקימנו והגיענו לזמן הזה, לזמן הזה.
Hi, I'm Rabbi Shavit Artson, the Rosalind and Abner Goldstein Dean of the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies at American Jewish University in Los Angeles. I'm here with my good friend and teacher, Rabbi Sharon Brous, the founding rabbi of Ikar, a spiritual community that's located in Los Angeles, but whose wonderful healing influences are spreading across North America and beyond. Welcome. I'm happy that we can be here, and I'm happy we can have a conversation to share with all of us thoughts that will prepare us for the holy days that are approaching. I know that this summer you had the opportunity to travel to Liberia in West Africa with the American Jewish World Service. And there you experienced a nation that is struggling with a tremendously violent recent past and with challenges of reconciliation. I wonder if you could share some thoughts and insights about your trip.
Sure. My interest in this region in West Africa emerged when I was in rabbinical school, and I started to study conflict resolution and human rights. And it was right in the moment when the wars in Sierra Leone and Liberia were really incredibly fierce. And I was particularly interested in child soldiers, these little children, 2, 3, 4-year-olds, usually boys, who were abducted, taken from their families, given drugs, and forced to commit really awful crimes against members of their own families and often members of their villages, so that they would have no way to ever return back home. And these were wars that were really defined by their brutality. And I became really consumed with the question of what would happen to these children and to their families when the war eventually ended. And I wondered if Jewish wisdom, if Jewish teachings on tshuva, on reconciliation and return and potentially even forgiveness might have some application in a global scene. Because the language of forgiveness is now becoming sort of a track to diplomacy in international politics, and people are understanding and recognizing that we need to not only have political responses to war and conflict, but also spiritual responses, because there's a healing process that needs to happen, not just a peace treaty. And so I spent a lot of time researching and learning about this region, and then just this past summer had the opportunity to travel with Ruth Messenger and a small group of people to experience firsthand what's going on post-conflict. The war ended and the disarmament occurred about 8 years ago, but this was a very long and particularly atrocious war that touched every single home. There wasn't a family that didn't lose somebody. There were 250,000 people killed out of a nation of 3 million, and so the destruction is vast and widespread. And I went with a particular eye toward reconciliation and the possibilities of bringing some of these ideas of healing into the discourse and conversation to see if that might help move things along in this country. What I found is that people were more interested in talking about moving on and getting jobs than they were in talking about digging back into the past and talking about their greatest trauma and trying to figure out if real healing was possible, which totally makes sense in a country where people are really living on one bowl of rice a day and there are no jobs to be had in the nation. And so the question is it possible to actually heal without digging into the past and trying to really understand what went wrong, what broke down in society, where individuals made real mistakes, and what kind of pain actually occurred. And it seems to me that that question is not only a political one, and not only one that applies in Liberia and Sierra Leone, but also a deeply personal one for us as well. What can we learn about the conflicts and struggles that we have in our own lives, and how willing are we to really go into the past and analyze and in some ways restructure our lives based on a revisiting of the past, or do we feel the need to just move on?
You know, I'm struck in that because I think sometimes if both parties are open to it, it's possible to have a kind of mutual confession and revisit it and repent of wrongdoing and then tuck it away. But sometimes, and I think one of the challenges for many of our congregants and many of us is that the person with whom we've had the conflict doesn't see it our way, and every time we raise the past, all it does is heighten the chasm that separates us. And in that case, I wonder if there's also wisdom in occasionally saying, we're not going to revisit the past. What we're going to do is hermetically seal it, and we're both together going to regret that we have incompatible ways of understanding it, and we're simply going to start a relationship that agrees to not open that box. And we're going to agree that our connection to each other is more important than what's in the box, so we're just going to move on. I wonder if there are any precedents for that or any insights along those lines.
So my sense is that I understand the instinct and the desire for that, but it's basically like putting a bandage over an infested wound. That what we need to be able to do in some ways in order to heal is we have to be able to clean out as much as possible, and then start the healing process. And of course there will be a scar, but I think that hermetically sealing the past doesn't work. The past continues to reemerge. And so my sense is, from the wisdom of our tradition, that what we have to do is we have to be willing to re-enter into some of the darkness of the past in order to try to find a way to deal with it responsibly so that we can build for the future. And it doesn't mean dwell permanently in the past. And think about the system of Yizkor for a moment, just to having the opportunity several times over the course of the year to just remember, to reflect and to remember and to weep, so that you can live for the rest of the year and really be present to life and not be, always consumed with the darkest moments. And so it seems to me that there has to be some kind of structure that can actually hold memory. And what we hear all of the time after there's been either war or personal struggle is forgive and forget. We have to move on. And this strikes me as a profoundly un-Jewish idea. That what we have to do is we have to go through a process of tshuva, which may or may not lead to forgiveness in the end. It often doesn't, especially when the act is something that there's no real recovery from. But it's a process. It's a process. There are steps to be taken anyway, and then to create space for memory, to actually hold the pain, to remember it, and to figure out how to tell the story of it for the next generation, and then to be able to begin to heal and move on. So it's not forgive and forget. It's actually, I think of it as sort of reconcile and remember, but create some kind of holy space that can hold the pain of the past so that we can actually move on in the present.
One of the places where Jewish tradition and contemporary science come together is that we've learned from neurobiology that memory is not simply a suitcase that contains something and you pull it out unchanged. Every time you remember something, you remember it. So people who lose the ability to see in color, their memories go to black and white because you reconstruct the memory every time you bring it out. You actively reshape it. And I think that's why Rambam, Maimonides, says that the act of tshuva shlema, complete tshuva, is when you're in that same position and you don't respond the same way again. So our memories aren't in the past. Our memories may be of the past, but they are very much alive. And in that sense, being courageous enough to take it out and re-contour it by a contemporary reaction may be a path to healing.
And one of my concerns is that without a process like this, so when the past inevitably revisits us, that we will do exactly the same thing that we did before, that we'll slip into patterns, or that, worse, that we seek revenge or retribution because the pain has never been dealt with in some responsible way before. And this is very much the impulse behind the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, which have been in a number of in dozens of countries around the world who've dealt with sort of post-conflict regions, which are not structured exactly the way I think a Jewish Truth and Reconciliation Commission would be structured. But at the same time, they understand that you cannot move to the future until you deal responsibly with the past. And so there has to be some voicing both of pain and victimization, and also of a kind of confession of what a person did that one regrets now that the conflict is over. And so, you raised earlier this interesting question of what happens when both parties aren't playing by the rules. So when you want to go through a process of tshuva, but the person on the other side isn't present. And so I think it's really important here that we create avenues and opportunities for people to begin to go through a healing process, or what we would call a tshuva process, even if the party on the other side is no longer alive or is no longer in the conversation. And I wouldn't always advise calling up the perpetrator and inviting them over so that you could have a process. I would almost never advise that, but creating space for there to be some kind of healing process so that a person who has been victimized is not a victim. And one of my good friends, Reverend Ed Bacon, writes that he once went through a writing exercise where people were asked to write out an outline of their autobiography where they saw themselves as the victim. And so imagine your life story if you saw yourself as the victim. And then they asked them to write out their life story in which you are the hero. So what does your life look like in broad strokes when you're the hero? And finally, to write out your autobiography in which you're a learner. And he says ultimately the goal is not to be a victim and not to be a hero, but just to be a person who's able to learn from life's struggles and life's triumphs. And it strikes me that one of the ways to leave victimhood behind is to acknowledge what happened in the past, to forgive yourself for being in the position in which that was able to happen in the first place, and then to stop seeing yourself only as a victim, but actually as a learner, someone who can take what happened in the past and find strength and empowerment and be able to build toward the future.
I guess the piece that feels missing in that, and it's a beautiful set of essays, is your life with you as the victimizer. Mm-hmm. Because so often we tell our story as though we are the victim, and our being a victim blinds us to the way we then in turn contribute to the victimization of others. And it's not one or the other. I think the challenge that life dishes out to us is that we are both victims and victimizers in various stories and in various ways. And that's part of the challenge of reconciliation. I remember a talk you gave a year or two ago in which you linked Yom Kippur and Yom Kippurim, that Yom Kippur and the day of Purim, the festival of lots, which are so different on the outside, have some deep similarity in helping us get to the chasm that is life and reorienting ourselves. I'm wondering if you'd be able to share some of those thoughts too, because it feels like it applies here.
I feel like this is the best stuff that they never taught us in religious school. But I've been thinking a lot over the past couple of years about really the connection between these two. Obviously it says in the Talmud that Purim is actually a day like, that Yom Kippur is a day like Purim, that Purim is kind of the ultimate holiday. And I've been working a lot to try to understand really what these 2 days are about at their essence. And it strikes me that the calendar kind of orbits around these 2 days, one in the fall and one in the spring, which are both essentially the same day, saying that life is capricious, that life is and precious, could end in an instant. And so you've got to figure out what to do and how to build a life of meaning given that reality. And the answers are incredibly similar, actually, even though they appear on the surface to be very different. So the Purim response is about feasting and revelry. The Yom Kippur response is about fasting and solemnity in many ways. But ultimately what they're saying is something needs to prick the conscience, so to speak, right? Something needs to happen at least twice a year to force you to recognize that everything you love could be gone in an instant, and that you might not be here tomorrow. And so what will you do about it? The response of Purim is matanot lavionim and mishloach manot, that you acknowledge the people you love in the world and you give them gifts of recognition and gratitude, and that you give to the poor, because that could be you tomorrow and it could have been you today. And the response of Yom Kippur is tshuva, tefillah, and tzedakah, that you respond to life's capriciousness by trying to rebuild the relationships that are most important in the world, by recognizing that you're not actually everything, that there's a force greater than you, and again, by working to make this world a more just world as long as we live in it. So it's sort of the recognition that everything might end tomorrow that sparks our obligation to be more responsible while we're here today. And just the piece that I find the most fascinating about this is that in some ways, for all of their similarities, they actually have in one way really the opposite perspective of humanity, and Purim is a more ennobled view of what man and woman is than Yom Kippur is, because what Yom Kippur is it says 2% of you is a really decent human being. 98% of you is schmutz, right? And so you come in and you spend 25 hours trying to cleanse the schmutz away so you can find that little precious point of goodness in you, and then that will hopefully illuminate the rest of you, and you can hold on to that for the rest of the year. Purim says the opposite. It says 98% of you is pretty decent, but 2% of you is a real, schmo. So what you have to do is come to terms with your 2% once a year so that you can actually give it some breath and space and light, and then you hide it away again at the end of Purim, because you don't want to live in that place. None of us want to live with that 2% exposed all year long. So that's the part that's actually different between the two. But I love the recognition that the part of us that's suppressed during the year is the part that needs to be exposed. In Purim's case, for a minute, and then we close it up again. In Yom Kippur space, and mentality, it needs to be exposed, hopefully, so that it will continue to reverberate throughout the rest of the year.
It occurs to me, maybe we have denominations wrong in America today. Maybe instead of the current denominations, we should have Purim Jews and Yom Kippur Jews, because your description of Purim and Yom Kippur were beautiful and profound and insightful, and completely the opposite of my own internal take. I think that Yom Kippur is a day in which we are all no longer in drag, right? So that on Yom Kippur is the one day of the year where we are the angels that we actually are. So we don't eat, we don't bathe, we don't put on jewelry, because you're beautiful as you are. And because your worth is this shimmering divine image that doesn't need material sustenance. So we gather together and we do what we do when we're truly ourselves. We sing and we rejoice and we cry and we embrace and we pray and we struggle. And we come to terms with being angelic. And Purim, I think, comes out of oppression and struggle. And so for me, there's always a feeling of this forced joy, which is part of recovering victimhood. Like we party too hard and we're compensating for being kicked out of the court and being under threat of death. And maybe, if anything emerges from the conversation, it's that both takes on the festivals contain important light. That there is a way in which it's, as you said, the shmo and the shmutz. Notice the sh is always a bad thing in Judaism. Or it could be that Purim is trying too hard to fend off recent victimhood and threat of death, and that Yom Kippur is misunderstood as this day of self-affliction, when in fact it's a day of coming out as an angel and of being the angel you truly are. In any case, so much to think about and so much to talk about. I want to thank you for joining us for this wonderful conversation. You see why Rabbi Brous enjoys the wonderful reputation that she does as a sage and as a teacher and a guide. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very meaningful Elul.